like to welcome everyone to the Vashon Heritage Museum History Talks. We'd like to recognize and thank For Culture for their sponsorship. Our presentation tonight, Presidential Elections on Vashon, Past and Present. 100 years ago, we were in a worldwide pandemic. The 1918 influenza ravaged the United States and influenced elections and politics for the next decade. The 2020 election is taking place during another worldwide pandemic. Our presenters tonight will take a look at the elections of 100 years ago. We'll examine the issues of the 2020 election and look at past presidential elections on Vashon. Joining us now, Dr. Allison Jansen earned her PhD in political science at the University of Washington. She is emeritus faculty in political science and gender studies at Green River College and is a lecturer in political science at UW. Her research and lecture focuses have included race, comparative electoral systems and elections, the media, disinformation, political ideologies, and economic inequality. Dr. Bruce Haulman is the president of the Vashon Heritage Museum, a retired professor of history at Green River College, and author of A Brief History of Vashon. Welcome and thank you, Allison and Bruce, for being here. And now let's start our presentation.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Allison, for joining us. I think as a historian and Allison as a political scientist, we always use the past to help us understand where we are today. And what you see in this slide is some of the issues from 100 years ago that have resonance with us today. We're in the middle of a pandemic. In 1918, America was in the middle of a pandemic. Children are being abused on the border. Child labor was a huge issue. Women's suffrage was an issue at the time. Women's rights are an issue today. The kleptocracy that sort of dominated the late 19th and early 20th century in the United States is still an issue today. And of course, the emergence of a new racial sort of tension in the United States. So the past does have lessons for us. And so what we want to do today is just take some time and look at those elections from 100 years ago, 1916, 1918, and 1920. And then Allison will look at the current 2020 election. And then at the end, I'll take you through the pattern of presidential elections on Vashon. So we hope it's an entertaining evening and hope it gives you some perspective on what we're looking at today with the presidential election of 2020. Now, the 1916 election was an election between Woodrow Wilson, incumbent president, a Democrat, and Charles Evans Hughes, who was Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Only time a major party has been represented by a Supreme Court justice. And of course, Hughes was a compromise candidate between the progressive and the conservative wings of the Republican Party. And Wilson, of course, was coming off of the 1912 election victory and sort of his record of progressivism. So during that election, there were issues that I think, again, resonate today. The progressive issues of trust busting, of the women's vote, suffrage, the move to an 8-hour day, the issue of child labor, and of course, the progressive reforms that tried to address sort of businesses and trusts and sort of the kinds of economic dominance that was taking place in the United States. At the same time, there were wars going on. There was a war going on in Europe. America was not yet part of it. And Wilson ran on a very strong platform of he kept us out of war. And there was a war going on in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution was going on, and Americans had sent troops into Mexico. And so that became part of the election mix, if you will, in 1916. It was a very close election. It was one of the closest electoral college elections in American history. Not quite as close as Gore versus Bush, but it was very close. And Wilson won by only 27 electoral votes, and carried California by less than 3,000 votes, less than 0.5% of the vote in California. So it was a closely sort of contested election, but Wilson won. At that time, presidential inaugurations occurred in March, not in January. So in March, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated. And in April, 1 month later, even though he won on a campaign if he kept us out of war, the United States enters World War I in April of 1917. Now, the 1918 election was a midterm election, so not a presidential election, but it took place in November of 1918, right in the middle of the influenza pandemic of 1918, sometimes called the Spanish flu. What we see is, and I've put a couple of slides up here for you to see: wear your mask, take your pencil to the poll. There was some concern about it. Polls did not open in some places, like in Shasta, California. Not enough people to serve as poll workers. So there was some impact. The turnout in that election was low. It was only about 40%. Whereas in elections before that, in 1912 and 1916, the turnout was in the mid 50%. So the pandemic seemed to have an impact on the election. But it was an election in which the pandemic was not an issue. And the pandemic would not be an issue in 1920 election either. So the main issues in 1918 were the war itself, and of course, senators and congressmen were running on their support for the war effort, and on suffrage. At that point, there were only three more states had approved the amendment for women's rights to vote. It would be passed the next year. What's interesting is all of the senators who were running for office who opposed women's suffrage lost in the 1918 election. So it was a clear sort of indication that the country was shifting attitudes. But the pandemic that was raging at the time doesn't seem to have been much of an issue. You don't see it in the campaign literature. You don't see it in the newspapers as a political issue, certainly as a medical issue, but not as a political issue. I wanted to take just a minute and sort of give you a sense of the impact of the pandemic, of 1918. Globally, 1/3 of all human beings were infected, 50 to 100 million deaths worldwide. In the United States, 25 to 40% infection rates. The average was 28% in the United States. It varied from state to state, and 675,000 Americans perished. So we're at 210,000+ right now. So we're 1/3 of the way to where the pandemic of 1918 was in terms of killing Americans. To give you a sense of it, this is an interesting graph. If you look at the dotted line, that's the sort of death rate. And you notice, relatively high rate with infants and under 4-year-olds, and then very low death rates until you get into the 50s and 60s, and then much higher death rates in the 75, 85+. The solid line is the death rate in 1918. And what you notice there is the death rate from 14 years old to 45 years old peaks. So that pandemic, unlike the current pandemic, really affected people in that sort of 15 to 45-year-old, mostly people in their 20s and 30s. And so it had a huge impact in that sense, whereas the pandemic today tends to have relatively low death rates for young people into middle age, and then accelerating death rates for older Americans. To give you a sense of the impact of this is the life expectancy of Americans by year, sort of from 1900 to 1980. And if you notice in 1918, there's a precipitous drop in the average life expectancy, because all of those sort of young adults in their 20s and 30s were dying as a result of the pandemic. Certainly younger people died and certainly older people died, but it was exceptionally lethal for those people in their 20s and 30s. And it's reflected in this life expectancy. But it doesn't seem to have been much of a political issue. So in the 1920 election, we have the Republicans, Harding and Coolidge, running against the Democrats, Cox and Roosevelt. Now, the issues in that election, I think, have a lot of resonance with the election of 2020. There was a struggle going on over internationalism. The League of Nations, which was pushed by Woodrow Wilson and opposed by much of the Republican Party, which is an interesting sort of reflection of what's going on today. There was growing racial conflict. The Ku Klux Klan was on the rise. There were issues of immigration. In the next 2 years, America would close its borders to immigrants from all over the world, but particularly from Asia and from Southern Europe and from other parts of the world, with some sort of leniency for immigration from Northern Europe. There was labor unrest after World War I, sort of riots in the street, the Seattle General Strike. So there was this sense of sort of rioting in the streets, if you will, was raised as an issue. The women's vote, this was the first presidential election in which women were able to vote. And of course, there was a growing sort of fear of the Russian Revolution, what would break out in a few years later in the Red Scare during the 1920s, the fear of communism that would dominate American politics up through the 1950s and 60s with the Cold War and this sort of struggle with Russia that still goes on, but in a very different sort of way and talking about it in a very different way. So in 1920, it was a very conflicted kind of country, a very conflicted election. And at the same time, you had a president who was disabled. Woodrow Wilson had had a major stroke. He was incapacitated. It was covered up by people in the White House. So you basically had Woodrow Wilson, the president, out of action during this election cycle in 1920. So another interesting kind of parallel, if you will. What won this election was basically Warren G. Harding and the return to normalcy. People were tired of the war. People were tired of struggle. The progressive reforms had been going on for 20 years. And what Warren G. Harding represented was essentially going back to an America that had never really existed, but the term normalcy that he used during the campaign. And he ran a campaign which was often called the front porch campaign. He did not get out and campaign. He sat at home on his porch in Ohio and basically sort of let the election come to him. So it was a very interesting kind of election for Americans. Now, at this point, let's turn it over to Allison. And Allison, I don't know if you want to leave this slide up or if you want me to pop out of this and you become full screen.
You can make me full screen, I guess.
Okay, let's try it. I haven't done that before.
This works.
Go to speaker view. There you go.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, thank you, Bruce. Thank you, Elsa. Thank you, Vashon Heritage Museum. We have an election in 26 days, and we are in the middle of another global pandemic. COVID has presented a challenge for holding safe and secure elections. This is manifesting in two principal ways. For the 45 states that do not have all mail-in voting, I bet you can name one of those states that does. So one is the fear of contagion for the voters in the polling place, in the long lines. And there's an even greater fear, Bruce mentioned, in 1918, not enough poll workers in some cases. And, we have that problem again. Poll workers tend to be older in higher risk groups. Not only would they be exposed but they'd be exposed all day. So they're more susceptible to complications or death, and they're not easy to replace. Poll worker training is often extensive, time-consuming, and younger voters usually have work conflicts or childcare needs. So the solution for many states is to move to mail-in voting or to amp it up, because most states, every state has some form of absentee balloting at least. And it's not new. Nearly 26% of American voters used the mail to vote in 2018. 5 states pre-COVID had all mail-in voting, and again, you can name one of them for sure. And the other 45 states had 3 choices, more or less. One, they could move to all mail-in voting. It took Washington and the other 4 states a while to work out all the kinks, but so, you know, conversely, our experience and lessons are transferable, so that's good. 2, states can significantly ramp up their absentee voting. This is a blurry category because most states already allow it without a reason. You don't have to have a good reason. You can just request an absentee ballot, and some states are promoting absentee balloting right now. In others, it is largely the Democratic Party or liberal nonprofits that are pushing it. 10 states are proactively sending absentee applications to everybody. And if you send it back in, you get an absentee ballot. Third option, you could continue for the few states that still require an illness or a travel excuse. You could continue to require that. And in Indiana, Louisiana, Tennessee, and Texas, that's what they're doing. Fear of COVID is not a valid reason for an absentee ballot. And in those states, and Mississippi and Missouri are kind of in that category as well. They have some, you know, some weird differences that would take too long to explain. Many Republicans seem to think that mail-in voting favors Democrats. Studies indicate that it has favored neither party. It has been pretty nonpartisan. This election will be different due to politicization. 70 to 80% of the absentee requests across the nation are coming from Democrats right now. So let's compare mail-in balloting versus walk-in balloting. Neither is perfect. They both have problems. Some states require several forms of ID. So if you're voting in person, that could be a problem. You show up, you don't have the right ID, or you forgot it, or you know, you just have the wrong one. For mail-in, great, you have time to copy it, but you have to copy it and send it in. And this is an equity issue. I have a printer sitting right next to me here. It also serves as a copier. I can just zip, copy it. Not everybody has those. Registration problems. If your name is spelled differently on different IDs, your registration can be dropped. And in some states, they do that a lot. The Constitution mandates that the states administer the elections. That means that we have 50 separate electoral systems, plus DC, plus the territories. However, we could say that we have 3,141 separate election systems, plus DC and the territories, because we have 3,141 counties or their equivalents, such as parishes. And generally they do the administering. I've seen another number of even 10,000 because some of those counties subdivide the responsibilities. Many countries have one national system. We very much do not. Traditional walk-in polling can have problems that mail-in voting does not have. Lines can be too long. Polling stations can move. Where do I vote? Polling stations can be too far away. Again, that's an equity issue. Election Day is not a holiday in the United States. Many have work conflicts. Usually, again, this affects low-income and minority voters the most. Mail-in balloting can have problems too. However, ballots can be delayed. It can be delayed getting to you. It can be delayed getting in on time to be counted. West Virginia, in addition to requiring a copy of your ID, also requires two witnesses for the signature. Some people don't get that, and then their ballot is thrown out. Wisconsin requires witnesses to also include their address. Family members might not realize that they have to add their address as well. In the Wisconsin primary for 2020 this summer, 23,000 ballots were thrown out. That's an interesting number. They were thrown out for either not having a witness signature or a witness address. That's the same number that gave Trump the margin of victory in the 2016 election. So 23,000 votes can matter. Also, voters make more mistakes when they're mail-in voting for the first time. A lot of people are doing it for the first time. None of this equals fraudulent voting, but it does mean confusion, it does mean challenges, and it does mean that ballots are going to be accidentally or not, they're going to be thrown out because they don't qualify, and I guess accidentally is probably the term. So fraud does happen. An incredibly small number of people cast votes, for example, in more than one state. They're registered in 2 places and they vote in both places. That's illegal. There are systems in place to catch that. Last week, Florida charged someone with fraudulently forging a signature and sending in his deceased wife's primary ballot. He was caught because the signature did not match well. People do get ballots for deceased people. Hardly anybody ever actually fraudulently sends it in. So to get the ballot is not fraud, as some people allege. All studies demonstrate that these instances are rare and inconsequential. Here in Washington, when Republicans challenged the Gregoire versus Rossi outcome in 2004, the court did find that in the state of Washington, there were 5 ballots in that near tie that were fraudulent. The Republicans brought those forth. The judge examined them, found out that they all voted for the Republican, and he threw them out, and Rossi lost 5 votes in that very close count. So partisan politics in 2020 has compounded all of this. Bruce, you can get ready to cue the slides. I'll be there in a few seconds. So unless you have lived off the grid, you know that President Trump has made nonstop attacks on our electoral system. He is not always coherent. He's not always consistent. Sometimes he gives greater emphasis to supposed problems with universal mail-in balloting, like we have here in Washington. Other times, absentee ballots are equally problematic. Other times, it just sounds like voting is the problem. You have heard or seen his statements and tweets. Are those going to come up? Working on it?
Yep, it should be up right now.
Okay, so I think we jumped ahead.
Let me go back. There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Okay, this is going to be a fraud. These are all Trump quotes. This is going to be a fraud like you've never seen. The November 3rd election result may never be accurately determined, which is what some want. The Democratic governor of Nevada. Can you imagine this man in charge of the ballots in Nevada? Governors are not in charge. Not fair. Rigged election. Next slide. The Democrats are trying to rig this election because it is the only way they are going to win. Mail ballots, they cheat. Mail ballots are very dangerous for this country because of cheaters. They go collect them. They are fraudulent in many cases. They have to vote. Mail carriers in West Virginia are selling the ballots. The postmen will falsify the ballots they collect from the mailboxes. Ballots are being dumped in rivers and creeks. This is not going to end well. When polls open, go to your polling place to see if it was counted. If not, vote. Your signed ballot will not count because your vote has been posted. Don't let them illegally take your vote away from you. There's so many problems with this particular statement. I've been complaining very strongly about the ballots, and the ballots are a disaster. Millions of ballots will be printed by foreign countries. If you have questions about any of these statements, feel free to ask at the end. So now Democrats are using mail drop boxes. This is a safety disaster for voters. Among other things, they allow one person to vote multiple times. I don't know how. Also, are people under their control placed in Republican or Democratic areas? I think maybe he meant to say the boxes. Mail-in ballots are a whole big scam. 2020 will be the most inaccurate and fraudulent election in history. Delay the election until people can properly, securely, and safely vote? Who cares? Will Trump accept the results if he loses? Well, we'll have to see what happens, he says. You know that. The only way we're going to lose the election is if the election is rigged. Remember that. Get rid of the ballots and you'll have a very peaceful, there won't be a transfer. Frankly, there will be a continuation. Okay, so that's the next part of the lecture coming up. So he has made numerous other such statements. Some of them are inarticulate and open to interpretation, but taken together, it is pretty clear that he has not committed to accepting a full count or to accepting certification by the 50 secretaries of state. So he's focused on mail-in ballots, but this is a rerun of what he said repeatedly in 2016. Here are just two examples. Chris Wallace asked him then if he would concede to a loss. Trump replied then, look, I have to see. No, I'm not going to say just yes. I'm not going to say no. At a 2016 rally, he said, I want to make a major announcement today. I would like to promise and pledge that I will totally accept the results of this great and historic presidential election. He then paused. He then pumped his hand with each word, if I win. The New York Times has counted over 2,000 times that he has challenged the legitimacy of the elections. So, does he have some valid concerns? Fraud was once common in the United States, especially in certain big cities. It lasted until just decades ago in Illinois and Louisiana. However, secretaries of state in all 50 states, Republicans and Democrats alike, and every election scholar I have seen disagree with him. Mistakes happen in every type of voting, but actual fraud is really rare. And when it happens, it involves really small numbers of votes. So why is Trump doing this? One, he follows and often repeats conspiracy theories. Probably a bigger reason, he can't accept losing. His ego is very fragile. He regularly portrays himself as a victim. He has apparently seen arguments, not backed up by evidence, that mail-in voting turns out more Democrats than Republicans. Of course, as I mentioned earlier, this will perhaps be a self-fulfilling prophecy in this election. It also serves to delegitimize the Democrat Biden if he ends up winning, at least in the eyes of Trump supporters. It will give Trump a political purpose as a leader, but also as a martyr. Trump can still keep the adoration and agitation of his supporters. He could even run again in 2024. And of course, fraud will not happen just because Trump says it will, but it is in his interest to create doubt and chaos. His campaign is also ready to file legal challenges in all 50 states. We have a lot of money behind this, all aimed at stopping the count or throwing out ballots. Demonizing mail-in ballots is just a new update built on his 2016 craziness. He said that election would be the most rigged in history. It was one more reason to lock up Hillary Clinton because she was doing it. And this is really significant. Before that, he said that the Republican primary elections were rigged as well. that was going to explain his loss when he lost the Republican primary. He expected to lose the 2016 elections, and he had an excuse, but he won. And then he still claimed that the popular vote was fraudulent. He was a sore winner. If his attacks are based on great exaggeration and fiction, can they actually accomplish anything? Well, similar attacks worked to flip the election in 2000. In Miami-Dade County, voting machines failed to count 60,000 ballots. Voters did, and in other counties as well. Voters did not always push that perforated hole all the way through. Machines kept skipping over these hanging chads, they were called. When the election board started a hand count, well-dressed GOP activists, why do I say well-dressed? Because it was referred to as the Brooks Brothers riot, illegally and violently stormed the election center and successfully stopped the vote. At the rate the vote was going, at the rate the count was going, it would have put Al Gore in a comfortable lead for the county and the state, and therefore in the Electoral College. But the chaos and intimidation worked. The election board stopped the count. Oh, the organizer, by the way, have you ever heard of a guy named Roger Stone? Yeah, that one, the one recently convicted of 7 election interference felonies. The one given a get out of jail card by Donald Trump. Yeah. And when the Florida State Supreme Court ordered a broader hand recount across the state, the conservative majority on the US Supreme Court stopped that count too. The justices even admitted that they had no constitutional basis for the decision. It was simply time to stop and move on. Trump echoes this when he says to call the election on election night. He also has been making a big deal that it's really, really important to get that 9th justice on the court, that 9th conservative, you know, that 6th conservative on the court before the election in case the election goes to the Supreme Court. Using a Freedom of Information Act request, a coalition of media organizations hired certified accountants and witnesses, and later hand counted all of the ballots in the state of Florida. Gore won. Trump might be hoping to create the red mirage. I don't know if you've heard this term. If his supporters vote in person, and then their votes will be counted first. If it can put Trump in the lead on election night, before later mail-in votes are counted. He has repeatedly said the election night count should be the one to be certified. Really, don't count all the votes. Count the ones on election night when he's ahead, and stop. He has already stated that he might not concede, even if the court says even if the counts say he is lost. He has indicated that he could reject the numbers. What happens if he refuses to leave the White House on January 20th? His attacks fit with the actions of the Republican Party over the last many years. Republicans, as a rule, fight to hinder more voter registration, more voting locations, ease of obtaining, completing, returning, and counting mail-in ballots, and in some significant cases, the full counting of ballots. As a rule, they enact laws to hinder voting by low-income citizens, minorities, and students. All are perceived as more likely to vote Democratic. In Texas, with the voter ID, you can use a conceal and carry permit as state issued as legitimate ID. If you get a photo ID from a state university, that doesn't count. Also, as an increasingly diverse US electorate is becoming a threat for the white majority identity of the GOP, it has increasingly moved to disenfranchise minorities. The GOP was empowered by the Supreme Court in 2013, Shelby County versus Holder. A 5-4 conservative decision removed federal oversight of the elections by the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department, meant to enforce the 1965 anti-racism provisions of the Voting Rights Act. Since 2013, state Republican legislators and governors have enacted or ordered a steady stream of voting restrictions. Voter ID laws sound sensible. but they disfavor low-income and minority voters. Before COVID, many Republican states were already eliminating polling stations in minority neighborhoods regularly. Last week, Texas Governor Greg Abbott mandated that each county can only have one drop-off box each. You have to put it in the postal service, which has not guaranteed that they'll get the mail there. The Trump campaign has filed lawsuits in several states already to restrict voting by mail. We've all seen how Trump is trying to make ballots late by hobbling the postal system. Those sorting machines that were taken out of the post offices and distribution centers, they have not been restored. Florida and other states have made it profoundly difficult for ex-felons to vote. Minorities, especially blacks, vote heavily Democratic. They are also more likely, much more likely to be profiled, prosecuted, and convicted of felonies. The Georgia Secretary of State in 2018 was Brian Kemp. In the 2018 election, he purged Georgia's rolls of 334,000 eligible voters before the 2018 election. The purges skewed almost 70% African American. He had already eliminated 214 polling places. On election day, polling stations did not get enough machines. Many failed to work. Lines were up to 5 hours long. They were 8 hours long this summer in the primary. Many voters gave up, went home, went back to work. Many did stick it out and found out they were purged from the rolls. That happened to the Democratic candidate for governor. Not only was Kemp the manager for the election, he was also the Republican candidate for governor. This should be illegal. He officially beat Democrat Stacey Abrams by less than 55,000 votes. By the way, well, I already said that. So the GOP rationale for voting and registration restrictions is always that voter fraud is rampant. And this is fundamentally false. Trump's attacks on mail-in voting are simply consistent with his party's agenda, even if it happens to fit his personality as well. So to summarize, mail-in ballots are a very safe alternative to walk-in balloting during a pandemic. Mail-in ballots are secure. Mail-in ballots do not promote fraud. They still might not be the best choice if rules make it hard to submit a valid ballot or ballots are delayed in the mail past deadlines. So depending on what state you're in, you should really figure out if you want to risk COVID and go vote in person to make sure your vote gets in. So I'm worried that large numbers of mail-in ballots will be tossed out in some states for technical reasons, enough to change the Electoral College. I am worried about it. In Washington, we're good. The rules are fair under a Republican Secretary of State. Everyone votes by mail. We have lots of drop-off boxes. All ballots count as long as they are postmarked or put in a collection box by Election Day. By the way, we have 73 election boxes in King County as opposed to the one per county in Texas. And if they have a problem with your signature and you put contact information on your envelope, they contact you to try to resolve it. They don't just throw out your ballot, as happens in many states. So moving to mail-in ballots because of COVID has given Trump a new angle to attack the 2020 election. Trump and the Republican Party are attacking democracy. They do not want all ballots counted. If we do get a red mirage on election night, it could help Trump's agenda of chaos. He plans to go to court everywhere. It is destabilizing. It is dangerous. It can overturn an election. Keep in mind that chaotic disinformation will be amplified by the Russians on social media. Trump knows this and has done nothing to rein them in. How will it turn out? Well, there's a lot we could speculate about. There are a lot of possible scenarios. Hey, Trump could win. Trump could clearly lose and transfer power, though he would certainly continue to claim fraud. Trump could clearly lose and refuse to leave. The odds increase if the count is close. We certainly can expect him to obstruct a fair count. So again, how will it turn out? Well, let's use a quote from Donald Trump himself will have to see. Thank you.
Thank you, Allison. Thank you very much.
Welcome.
Lots to think about there. It's interesting when you look at that, what Allison has just talked about. And what I want to do is take you on a really very quick sort of run through elections on Vashon, presidential elections on Vashon. And I don't think there's going to be much doubt about the outcome of the election on Vashon in 2020. And let me tell you why. 100 years ago, Vashon was reliably Republican. 1904, 87% Theodore Roosevelt, 12% Parker. 1916, a very close national election, 51.3% Republican. 1920, 71%, almost 72%, 73% Republican in 1928. Vashon was rural, it was agricultural, it was in the West, it was solidly Republican. Most of the early settlers on Vashon were veterans of the Civil War, and so were Republicans, the party of Lincoln. And of course, the Republican Party was a very different party than it is today 100 years ago. So Vashon was reliably Republican in the first part of the 20th century. Then the Great Depression hits, and Vashon for the first time votes for a Democratic presidential candidate, 52.3% for Franklin Roosevelt. 8% for third parties. That's an interesting figure. And third parties don't figure in every election, but on some elections and in some elections on Vashon, they do play a role. 60% almost in 36, a little over 50% in 1940. I could not find the statistics for 1944, but Franklin D. Roosevelt did win that election. So from the Great Depression in the 30s through the 40s, after World War II, through World War II, Vashon was not overwhelmingly, but was voting Democratic. After World War II, with the 1948 election through the 1960 election, Vashon votes Republican. It sort of goes back to its Republican base. Almost 58% Republican for John Dewey, 65 and 63% for Dwight D. Eisenhower in 52 and 56, and Nixon wins in 1960. In the 1960s and 70s, Vashon is beginning to change. Counterculture comes to Vashon. Vashon becomes known as the hippie island. You begin to get a change in the demographics. You get a lot more commuters, begins to suburbanize in the 1960s and 1970s. Lyndon B. Johnson wins over Goldwater in 1964. 1968 is a pretty interesting election. Richard Nixon wins with 49% of the vote, but 8.6% of the vote goes to the American Independent Party, George Wallace, 42% for Hubert Humphrey. Nixon wins again in 72, and Gerald Ford wins in 76. So Republican, but less sort of dramatically Republican than they were 50 years earlier. Things begin to change with the 1980 election on Vashon. And what's interesting here is that Reagan wins Vashon with 44.8%, 45% of the vote, but 37, almost 38% for Jimmy Carter, and 17% for the liberal Republican independent candidate, John B. Anderson. So if you put the Democrat and the independent together, the liberal vote on Vashon, if you will, in 1980, Vashon's beginning to shift away from that conservative Republican bias to a more liberal Democratic bias. Mondale wins in 84, Dukakis wins in 88. And so you start to see Vashon becoming reliably Democratic. Through the 90s, Bill Clinton, Al Gore win the elections. And so what you're seeing is Vashon's becoming reliably Democratic. After 2000, Vashon becomes what the Seattle Times calls ultra-liberal Vashon. 2004, 77% Democratic, 82% in 2008, 80% in 2012, 84% in 2016. So in the 2020 election, I don't have much doubt that on Vashon at least, that the outcome is going to be very clear. And because we do mail-in ballots on Vashon as part of the state of Washington, I think we'll get very clear election results and we'll have very clear kind of outcome. And I expect to see Biden win by probably close to 90% of the vote on Vashon. So that's a quick sort of run through the Vashon vote, but it's interesting to look at how Vashon shifted from being reliably Republican in the 70s and 80% voting at the beginning of the 20th century. And by the beginning of the 21st century, in 100 years, has shifted to being that same kind of percentage, 70, 80% voting Democratic. So that's a quick overview. Now we've got some time for some questions. Allison, you have any comments?
No, I certainly enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Yeah. Elsa, are you there?
I'm here. Thank you, Bruce, and thank you, Allison. That was
welcome.
Great. That was really interesting. We do have a couple questions, and we also have about 10 minutes before the hour, so people can put in questions. That would be great. Here's a question, or it's a comment and a question. I don't understand why we sound like a developing country in terms of voting. It's foundational rather. Why don't we have one simple national system administered by states? Seems like a no-brainer. And then, is that revealing my ignorance about local politics?
Do you want to take it, Bruce, or should I?
Allison, why don't you take that, and then let me comment as well.
Sure. Well, when we were founded as a unified state, the United States of America, it was made up of the 13 colonies, and they all had strong individual identities. The word state meant independent country, and under the Articles of Confederation, there were 13 independent countries that formed the United Independent Countries, the United States of America. And so when they created the federal system, they wanted to retain a fair degree of independence in the federal system that they created. And so one of the things they did was they left the elections to the administration of the states.
Yeah, there's a famous adage about the Civil War that it was really fought over a verb, that it was fought over the concept of the United States are, and after the Civil War, the United States is. Yeah. It was a struggle really over that very issue that Allison talked about. Also, I've spent quite a bit of time in Australia and New Zealand, as Allison well knows, and both of them have what they call electoral commissions. They are independent government bodies that run all the elections, from local elections to national elections. And they're all run exactly the same every place in the country. Every city, every town, every state, every province votes in exactly the same way, has exactly the same kind of ballots, and it works very well. And the Australian and New Zealand electoral commissions help run elections all over the world. They've never been invited to the United States to help us run our elections yet. But it is interesting that there is an alternative to what we do. But like
about 100 years ago, we did borrow that interesting concept called the Australian ballot.
Right.
Yes, the secret ballot.
But not the Electoral Commission.
No.
This question, it's a two-part. The first part's for Allison, or well, two questions. Allison, do you have any faith in polls after the 2016 mess?
Well, this may surprise you, but I do, because contrary to the big conclusion that people took away from 2016, the polls were actually fairly accurate if you look at the national polls. Hillary Clinton was ahead by 3%. It was very close. She came out 2% ahead. She was 3 million votes ahead. So pretty close. The margin of error, could have meant that it could have been an exact tie. And where the weakness was we didn't have good enough polling in the individual states. And there is better polling in the states this time around. So I think these polls are a bit more accurate than those. So yeah, I do.
Okay, thank you. Bruce, are there any parallels between the Republican Party of 100 years ago and liberal value today?
Yeah, very much so. You have to remember the Democratic Party was the party of the South. The Blue Dog Democrats, if you will. The Democratic Party was opposed to any legislation to limit lynchings. Was supportive of the Ku Klux Klan. It was a really interesting sort of shift because the Democratic Party at that time had its major base in the South and the defeated South, if you will, after the Civil War, whereas the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln and the party of the North. So very, very different in that sense. And I think what you see is that both parties had strong progressive wings in them, and the progressive sort of movement from 1900 to 1920, you saw lots of reform coming out with bipartisan support. But in terms of race and in terms of internationalism, the Democratic Party under Wilson was very much the party of the League of Nations and America's role as a world leader. And being engaged with the world. The Republicans, after Theodore Roosevelt, had basically pulled back from international engagement. So yeah, so there's some interesting sort of shifts that take place. The Republican Party of 1900, 1910 in the United States and on Vashon had some of the more liberal values of the time, like the Democratic Party does today. Allison, you want to follow up with that at all?
That was a good answer.
Thanks.
Well, we do have a couple more questions here. So what are the Democrats doing to fight the upcoming election fight by the Republicans?
Well, I emphasize that the Republicans have legal teams set up in all 50 states. The bigger ones are in the swing states, where their fights are more likely to matter. And the Democrats are spending just as much money on legal teams, and they also have deployed them to all 50 states. The difference is that the Republican teams are trying to make sure that ballots are not counted, and the Democrats are trying to make sure that ballots are counted.
So this one, thank you, Allison. This one's for Bruce. Bruce, what do you attribute the votes for independent parties, and what was happening in 1968 that would give rise to votes for Wallace?
Well, Wallace came across in 1968, the American Independent Party was a party of anti-integration. So it's a segregation party. Vashon always, up through the middle of the 20th century, had very few African Americans on the island, and African Americans were viewed as a threat on the island. In the 1930s, when a group of sort of Dust Bowl refugees, African Americans, came to the island, there were island-wide meetings about what to do about the quote-unquote Negro problem on Vashon. You're talking about 10 or 12 African Americans settling on the island. So Vashon doesn't have a particularly sterling race relations history, particularly in the first 2/3 of the 20th century. It begins to change after the 1980s and 1990s as you begin to get more diversity on the island. You know, Vashon, Japanese homes were burned on Vashon to keep Japanese from returning. African Americans were not welcomed on the island. So it's my sense is that that vote, that very conservative vote on Vashon, went for Wallace in 1968.
Can you discuss the impact of the Supreme Court 2013 decision that struck down key elements of the 1965 Voting Rights Act? The 5-4 vote eliminated requirements in 9 key states to have their voting laws reviewed at the federal level. Do you have a sense of how it freed those states to create new barriers to voting?
Oh, it freed them up rather quickly, and in the states that were dominated by Republicans, and all 9 of those states were, and it had gone beyond the South to the Southwest. Arizona was one of those 9 states. Sounds like the person asking the question actually knows something about this already. So just a little interesting footnote. Arizona was added after they had, the Republican Party had organized what they call poll watchers, where they sent people, they hired off-duty police wearing their guns and their badges to intimidate minorities, Latinx and African American, Native American voters. You know, are you sure you're registered? You know, it's illegal to vote if you're not properly registered, and scared people away. The person in charge of that was not involved in the 2013 decision. He was deceased by then, but his name was William Rehnquist, who then goes on to be named as, you know, Chief Justice of the Supreme Court later. So it simply freed those states to proceed with voter intimidation, and it spread to other states. The voter ID laws are the #1 thing. There are records that come out where they don't cover their tracks well enough, where people admit that it's designed to limit registration, or rather voting by minorities. In North Dakota. So this is the thing, once the wheel got spinning, it spread to other Republican dominated states. So in North Dakota, they passed voter ID laws that said that you have to have ID with your street address on it. Well, they have, you know, the Lakota Sioux and other native tribes who live on reservations, and the people who live on reservations very seldom have a street address. They use P.O. boxes for their mail. So their IDs don't have street addresses, and they were therefore automatically disqualified from voting. The Republicans in control in Pennsylvania put in voter ID laws. I mentioned, you know, Texas's, you know, requirements of student ID versus, you know, a gun permit as to what was valid. So they've been running rampant, and they have been, you know, what a lot of people don't realize is that for older minority voters in the South, a lot of them don't even have birth certificates, because they weren't allowed, you know, their parents weren't allowed into hospitals when, you know, to give birth. So they don't have valid ID. If they, and just to get the valid ID, maybe it's a long bus ride to the county courthouse. Lots of complications. The reality is that they are keeping minorities from registering to vote. I don't know. You want to add anything to that, Bruce? Or?
No, it's a long pattern in American history.
Yeah. So throwback to Jim Crow.
So here's a comment and a question. Today's division seems paramount. Racial resentment, culture wars, etc. Ziblatt and Levinsky in How Democracies Die concluded by saying, we have never seen a multiracial and generally democratic government. What are the prospects to move beyond the culture wars and racial issues now at a peak to achieve the promise of American equality?
If I can take a first shot at that, I think both Allison and I mean, we've taught young people our whole lives. Many of these issues are not issues for people under 30 years old. I mean, there's certainly hardcore, groups in every demographic. But largely my experience with young people in their 20s and teens, many of these issues are not issues. LGBTQ rights, racism, those are just not issues for them. That you're talking about 50 and 60-year-old people dominating this conversation. Allison, you want to?
Yeah, no, that's where I was going to go as well. The clock moving forward will help us. And it's not just youth, but the diversity. So California is already, minority majority. Other states are moving that direction. The country as a whole is moving that direction. So before when Barack Obama was elected, there was a lot of encouragement that, oh wow, we've made a lot of progress. A lot of people were able to put on blinders and think, wow, we've done it. But Donald Trump was out there during the Obama administration, stirring this all up. He became the leader of the birther movement. And he has given permission to the bigots, to the zealots. And the part I actually confess to having a hard time understanding is the propensity to follow conspiracy theories. QAnon, Hillary Clinton and Tom Hanks and Barack Obama are imprisoning and killing children for their adrenal glands. I mean, the fact that we have a president who plays to it, who introduces the Secretary of State, or as I like to call him, the Secretary of the Deep State. He plays to the QAnon followers. He seemingly believes many conspiracy theories, and so do his avid followers. That part's confusing. So in the short term, I think things are dark. I really do. If Donald Trump is successfully removed from office, he's going to continue to have a following, and he's going to continue to stir things up. And there are plenty of other people like him who will continue to do the same thing. But Bruce is right. For the longer term, the people who are younger and more diverse, things will change.
Well, thank you, Allison and Bruce. We're past our hour now, and the questions have there are no more questions, so I think we can conclude now. And thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you,
You
Allison.
bet.
I really enjoyed it. And thank you, Elsa.
Mutually.
Take care.
Thank you. Okay, take care, everybody. Good
Good
night.
night, everybody.
Good night.